Daniel Reeves had lived in the neighborhood for exactly 11 years, 3 months, and 6 days. Not approximately. Not about a decade. Exactly. He was the kind of man who paid attention to details most people overlooked: the quiet hum of the security gate motor as it opened each morning, the faint chemical scent of freshly treated grass drifting through the air every Thursday, the subtle weight difference between regular mail and a certified letter before he even looked at the label. This wasn't just a house to him. It was a place he had watched take shape from bare land into a polished, controlled community. Back when he first stepped onto the property, there were no fences, no HOA warnings, no perfectly aligned mailboxes. Just open lots, survey stakes, and possibility. He had chosen this exact spot deliberately, long before most of his neighbors even knew the development existed. For years, everything had been quiet, predictable, almost too perfect. Daniel kept to himself, followed reasonable guidelines, and never gave the HOA a reason to notice him. But that changed about 6 months ago. The first notice seemed minor: 250 for an improper mailbox color. Daniel had stood there holding the letter, running his fingers across the smooth paper, noticing how official it felt compared to the trivial complaint it carried. He paid it without argument. Then came the next one: $1,200 for a non-compliant driveway surface. That one made less sense. The driveway hadn't changed. Not recently. Not ever. Still, the tone of the letter had shifted: less suggestion, more command. After that, the notices came faster, more frequent, more aggressive, each one stacking on top of the last, both financially and psychologically. Now, standing in his driveway with a tow truck idling nearby and a fence dividing his property, Daniel could still smell that same freshly cut grass in the air, like the neighborhood was trying to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't, because this wasn't about a mailbox anymore. The HOA wasn't just issuing fines. They were escalating, pushing, testing boundaries. And for the first time since he moved in, Daniel wasn't just dealing with paperwork or warnings. He was standing on the edge of losing his home. The tow truck's chains snapped tight around the black SUV with a sharp metallic crack that echoed across the quiet street, and the driver leaned out the window just as a calm voice cut through the morning air: "If that truck moves one more inch, your company is liable for exactly $187,500 in damages." The number hung there, precise, unshaken. It was 7:42 a.m. in a gated suburban community where nothing louder than a lawnmower usually disturbed the silence. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across bright green lawns, birds chirped from neatly trimmed trees, and sunlight reflected cleanly off identical rooftops. But right in the middle of that perfect calm, something was very wrong. A bright orange notice had been slapped across the homeowner's front door, bold black letters screaming, "Property under HOA lien, access restricted." And as if that wasn't enough, a temporary wooden fence had appeared overnight, cutting straight through the driveway like a border drawn by force. Fresh posts, still rough at the edges, split the property in two. Neighbors were already gathering at a distance. Some stood on sidewalks pretending to check their phones. Others peeked through half-open blinds. One whispered, barely audible, "They've never done this before." The man in the navy blazer Daniel stepped forward slowly, his shoes crunching lightly against the gravel edge of the driveway. His expression didn't match the chaos. No panic, no anger, just focus. The HOA president stood a few feet away, clipboard tucked firmly against her chest, posture rigid with authority. "You've ignored repeated violations," she said sharply. "This property is now under enforcement action." Daniel didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved from the notice on the door to the fence, to the chains tightening around his SUV. Every detail registered, every move calculated. Then finally he spoke, quiet, controlled. "You're enforcing the wrong property." A few neighbors exchanged confused looks. The president let out a short, dismissive laugh. "No," she said, stepping closer, "we're enforcing yours." Behind her, the tow truck engine growled slightly as the driver adjusted the controls. The chains pulled tighter. The vehicle shifted just enough to signal it was about to move. Daniel reached into his jacket, not rushed, not nervous, just deliberate. And for the first time, something about him didn't fit the situation at all, because while everyone else saw a homeowner about to lose everything, Daniel looked like someone who had been expecting this. By mid-morning, what started as a quiet enforcement issue had turned into something far more aggressive, something that didn't feel like routine HOA procedure anymore. It felt coordinated, intentional. Two contractors in reflective vests moved, with mechanical efficiency, unloading pre-cut wooden panels from the back of a truck. The sharp thud of posts hitting the ground echoed unnaturally loud against the calm suburban backdrop. Without hesitation, they began installing a temporary fence right through the middle of Daniel's driveway. Not along the edge, not near a boundary line, directly through it, as if drawing a line where one had never existed before. Each hammer strike sent a dull vibration through the concrete. Dust lifted into the air in small clouds, catching the sunlight before settling again. Within minutes, the structure started to take shape, dividing the property into two uneven halves. A uniformed security guard stood nearby, arms crossed, feet planted firmly, watching everything with a rigid, almost rehearsed posture. He wasn't there for safety, he was there for control. The HOA president moved between the workers and the driveway, issuing instructions with clipped precision. Her clipboard never left her side. "Make sure that section is fully secured," she said, pointing toward the garage access. "We need clear documentation of non-compliance." Nearby, the tow truck engine idled low, a constant mechanical hum underlining the scene. The driver leaned against the side of the truck, glancing between Daniel and the HOA team. "I've done repos before," he muttered quietly, almost to himself. "But this feels different." "It's not your concern," the president replied sharply without looking at him. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching everything unfold. His posture remained relaxed, almost detached, but his eyes tracked every movement, the placement of each post, the alignment of the fence, the angle of the chains tightening around his SUV. Nothing escaped his attention. Finally, the president turned back to him, her tone firm and final. "This is your last notice. Pay the $14,860 in accumulated fines, or we proceed with full lien enforcement." Daniel let the number settle for a moment. Then he asked, quietly, "$14,000 for a mailbox and concrete?" "You ignored repeated warnings." He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than her words. Then, almost casually, he said, "You should have checked the original site plan." She frowned slightly. "What does that even mean?" But Daniel had already turned away, pulling his phone from his pocket. Because whatever was happening here, he knew something they didn't. By noon, the situation had crossed a line that even the most compliant neighbors couldn't ignore. A second notice appeared on Daniel's front door, larger, harsher, impossible to miss. Bright red letters stretched across the page. Intent to foreclose under HOA authority. The color alone felt aggressive, almost theatrical, like it was designed to humiliate as much as enforce. A low murmur spread through the small crowd that had gathered along the sidewalks. One neighbor actually stepped closer, squinting at the notice as if hoping they had read it wrong. "Foreclosure? Over fines?" someone whispered. Another voice followed, quieter but sharper. "That doesn't sound legal." But no one stepped forward. No one challenged it directly. The HOA president, however, showed no hesitation. She paced along the edge of the driveway with controlled intensity, heels clicking against the concrete in a steady rhythm. "We have full authority under the covenants," she said, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. It wasn't just a statement, it was a performance. Daniel stood near the divided edge of his driveway, the shadow of the temporary fence cutting across his shoes like a boundary line. The smell of heated wood and disturbed dust lingered in the air. He glanced at the new notice, then at the tow truck, then back at the president. "You're pushing this pretty far," he said calmly. "You pushed it first," she replied without missing a beat. "You chose not to comply." Behind her, the tow truck engine revved slightly, the driver adjusting his position as if waiting for a final signal. The chains tightened just enough to suggest movement was imminent. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, pulling his phone from his pocket again. His movements were unhurried, almost out of sync with the urgency around him. "You filed the lien this morning?" he asked. "Correct," she said. He nodded once. "Then timing is going to matter a lot." She narrowed her eyes. "What is that supposed to mean?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply tapped his screen and waited. Inside the house, the chaos outside faded into a dull, distant hum, the low growl of the tow truck, the occasional metallic clang, voices blending into indistinct noise. But in here, everything felt controlled, measured. Daniel moved straight to his office without hesitation. The room was neat, almost clinical. A solid wooden desk sat near the window, where thin strips of sunlight filtered through the blinds, laying sharp lines across the surface. Dust particles drifted slowly in the air, visible only when they crossed the light. He crouched slightly and pulled open the bottom drawer. It slid out smoothly, revealing a row of carefully arranged folders. Nothing was out of place. Each one labeled, each one aligned. His hand moved past newer files without even pausing. Recent bills, HOA notices, routine paperwork. Those weren't what he needed. Then he reached the back, a thicker folder, slightly worn at the edges, older, important. He pulled it out and placed it on the desk with quiet precision. For a moment, he just rested his hand on top of it, as if acknowledging what it contained. Then he opened it. Inside were documents most homeowners would never think to keep: original land surveys, zoning maps, early development filings, papers that carried history, authority, context. He began flipping through them slowly. No panic, no urgency, just confirmation. Each page turned with a soft, deliberate sound, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Then he stopped. One page caught his attention, a detailed site map, lines clean and exact, boundaries marked with precision. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he focused on a specific section. He traced a boundary line with his finger, followed it carefully. There it was, subtle, easy to miss, but unmistakable. A quiet shift crossed his expression, not surprise, not relief, certainty. He leaned back slightly, exhaling once, like a calculation had just been confirmed beyond doubt. Then he reached for his phone and dialed without hesitation. "Hey," he said calmly when the call connected. "I need you to come down here, right now, outside." The situation was spiraling. Inside, Daniel had just found the one thing that could stop it. When Daniel stepped back outside, the contrast was immediate. The calm of the house disappeared, replaced by the sharp edge of confrontation waiting in the driveway. The tow truck engine idled low, vibrating through the ground, while the metallic chains around his SUV creaked under pressure. The temporary fence cast a hard shadow across the concrete, dividing the space like a line that shouldn't exist. The HOA president stood exactly where he'd left her, posture rigid, clipboard still, pressed against her side. But now there was something slightly different: an impatience, a need to finish what she had started. Daniel walked toward her at an even pace, the folder tucked under his arm. "No rush, no hesitation. You're about to remove a vehicle from land you don't control," he said calmly. She didn't blink. "We control all enforcement zones within the community." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Is that what you think this is?" "It's what the documents say." "Which documents?" For just a fraction of a second, she hesitated. Barely noticeable but real. Behind her, the tow truck operator shifted his weight, glancing between them. "You sure you want me to keep going?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," she snapped. "Proceed." The chains tightened again with a sharp metallic pull. Daniel let out a small breath, almost like he expected that answer. "All right," he said quietly. He stepped back, pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Then he raised it slightly, placing the call on speaker. The faint connection tone cut through the air, followed by a calm, professional voice. "This is a recorded line. Please confirm the property in question." Daniel looked directly at the HOA president. "Go ahead," he said. "Tell them." She frowned, clearly thrown off. "I don't need to. You've already started enforcement," Daniel interrupted, still calm. "Might as well finish explaining it." The voice on the phone repeated. "We need confirmation of the parcel number." The neighbors had gone completely quiet now. Even the tow truck operator had stopped moving for the first time. The momentum shifted, and the HOA president just slightly looked unsure. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He opened the folder slowly, the motion deliberate enough that everyone watching seemed to lean in without realizing it. The paper inside caught the sunlight, clean lines, official markings. Nothing dramatic at first glance. But Daniel wasn't looking at the crowd. His attention was fixed on one person. This, he said calmly, lifting the top page just enough to be seen, is the original development filing for this property. The HOA president frowned immediately. We already have records, no, Daniel interrupted, still composed. You have revised copies. This is the one that came before all of that. He flipped the page with a soft, controlled motion and tapped a specific section, parcel 17B. He said, his tone precise, was never transferred into HOA control. Silence fell hard. The tow truck engine idled in the background, suddenly too loud in the stillness. Even the faint rustle of leaves seemed to pause. The president blinked, her grip tightening slightly on the clipboard. That's not possible, Daniel finally met her eyes. It is, he said simply. He turned the document outward just enough for her to see the boundary lines clearly marked. The detail was undeniable, clean, official, recorded. That parcel, he continued, was retained under developer authority for access and infrastructure purposes. Her expression shifted, confusion breaking through confidence. Then who? Daniel didn't let her finish. I am the developer. The words didn't land all at once. They settled slowly, like a realization no one there had prepared for. Around them, no one spoke, because in that moment, everything the HOA thought they controlled changed. The silence after Daniel's words wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. The kind of silence that makes people suddenly aware of every small sound. The distant hum of a passing car outside the gate, the soft creak of the temporary fence shifting slightly in the wind, the uneven breathing of people who no longer knew what to do next. The HOA president stood frozen for a moment longer than she intended. Her clipboard lowered just a few inches, a subtle but visible crack in her authority. Daniel didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He simply held the document steady between them. You initiated enforcement on a parcel you don't legally control, he said calmly. That means every action taken from this point forward is unauthorized. Her jaw tightened. We acted based on registered HOA authority. You acted on incomplete records, Daniel corrected, his tone still even. That's not the same thing. The tow truck operator finally stepped back from the vehicle, loosening the tension on the chains. The metal slackened with a dull clink, the sound echoing like a quiet reversal. One by one, the people around them began to shift, subtle movements of uncertainty. The security guard adjusted his stance. A contractor lowered his tool halfway. Even the neighbors watching from a distance seemed unsure whether to stay or leave. The HOA president glanced at her team, but no one met her eyes the same way anymore. Daniel finally stepped forward just enough to close the gap between certainty and authority. Not aggressive, just present. This doesn't escalate further, he said. It ends here. The words weren't a threat. They were a conclusion. And for the first time since the morning began, the people enforcing control realized they were no longer the ones in control. The reversal didn't arrive as a dramatic announcement. It came as a sequence of controlled, procedural corrections that slowly unraveled everything the HOA had rushed to enforce. The first sign was the tow truck. The operator, after a brief call on his radio, disengaged the vehicle completely. The chains that had once pulled tight around Daniel's SUV now slackened, then dropped with a heavy metallic clang onto the driveway. The sound echoed longer than it should have, as if the neighborhood itself was absorbing the correction. Next came the fence. The contractors who had installed it so aggressively just hours earlier now stood still, waiting for instructions that never came. One of them looked toward the HOA president, but she didn't respond. After a long pause, the tools were set down. The posts that had been hammered into place began to feel temporary, Almost embarrassed in their presence, Daniel remained where he was, watching everything unfold without urgency. No celebration crossed his face. No satisfaction was performed. For the crowd, only quiet confirmation that the system correcting itself was working exactly as expected. The HOA president finally spoke, but her voice had changed. The authority that once filled her tone had thinned. "We will need to initiate an internal compliance review immediately," she said, carefully choosing her words now. Daniel nodded once. "You should." Within hours, the official chain reaction began. The lien was formally withdrawn. Emergency legal review was initiated by the HOA's own counsel. Communication shifted rapidly from enforcement language to correction language. Phrases like valid action were replaced with procedural error and boundary misinterpretation. By the next morning, the bright red foreclosure notice was gone from the front door. In its place was a neutral printed statement, carefully worded and stripped of authority. "All enforcement actions related to Parcel 17B are hereby rescinded pending legal review of property boundaries." But the most visible change wasn't on paper, it was in behavior. The HOA board, once confident in its decisions, now moved cautiously. Meetings that had once focused on enforcement became discussions about verification. Procedures were questioned, line by line. Assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years were now being rechecked against actual records. Even the temporary fence left behind only faint marks in the soil, like a mistake that the ground itself was already trying to forget. And, for the first time, the neighborhood understood something quietly powerful. Authority only holds until it is proven correct. The reversal didn't arrive as a dramatic announcement, it came as a sequence of controlled, procedural corrections that slowly unraveled everything the HOA had rushed to enforce. The first sign was the tow truck. The operator, after a brief call on his radio, disengaged the vehicle completely. The chains that had once pulled tight around Daniel's SUV now slackened, then dropped with a heavy metallic clang onto the driveway. The sound echoed longer than it should have, as if the neighborhood itself was absorbing the correction. Next came the fence. The contractors who had installed it so aggressively just hours earlier now stood still, waiting for instructions that never came. One of them looked toward the HOA president, but she didn't respond. After a long pause, the tools were set down. The posts that had been hammered into place began to feel temporary. Almost embarrassed in their presence, Daniel remained where he was, watching everything unfold without urgency. No celebration crossed his face. No satisfaction was performed. For the crowd, only quiet confirmation that the system correcting itself was working exactly as expected. The HOA president finally spoke, but her voice had changed. The authority that once filled her tone had thinned. "We will need to initiate an internal compliance review immediately," she said, carefully choosing her words now. Daniel nodded once. "You should." Within hours, the official chain reaction began. The lien was formally withdrawn. Emergency legal review was initiated by the HOA's own counsel. Communication shifted rapidly from enforcement language to correction language. Phrases like valid action were replaced with procedural error and boundary misinterpretation. By the next morning, the bright red foreclosure notice was gone from the front door. In its place was a neutral printed statement, carefully worded and stripped of authority. "All enforcement actions related to Parcel 17B are hereby rescinded pending legal review of property boundaries." But the most visible change wasn't on paper, it was in behavior. The HOA board, once confident in its decisions, now moved cautiously. Meetings that had once focused on enforcement became discussions about verification. Procedures were questioned, line by line. Assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years were now being rechecked against actual records. Even the temporary fence left behind only faint marks in the soil, like a mistake that the ground itself was already trying to forget. And, for the first time, the neighborhood understood something quietly powerful. Authority only holds until it is proven correct.